Hello and greetings from me to you for the day. I am Dr. Golda Vaz, Assistant Professor at the Department of Psychology, Parvatibai Chogle College of Arts and Science Autonomous, and today I'm going to talk to you about neurons, neural impulse, and the synaptic transmission. Module 6 of Chapter 2 Biological Foundations of Behavior. Briefly, I will discuss the neural impulse, specifically about action potential, the synaptic transmission, and the neurotransmitters that are present in our body. At the end of the class, you will be able to explain what a neural impulse is, describe and explain what an action potential is, describe the synaptic transmission, and identify some neurotransmitters and their functions. So, moving on, a neuron sends information through its axon in the form of a brief impulse. A neural impulse is actually a way neurons communicate with each other. You can think of it as an electrical wave that gushes from one neuron through the dendrites to the axon and towards the next waiting neuron. By changing the rate and timing of the signals, the neuron can vary its message. Well, that depends on the electric charge, the voltage that is present inside and outside the neuron, which is responsible for the speed of each signal that goes from one neuron to the other. This electrical wave is called the action potential. It sweeps down, it comes from the dendrites, sweeps down to the axon. And when an action potential is happening, it is said that the nerve or the neuron is firing a signal. Now, the nerves or neurons work on the all or none principle. That means every neuron has a threshold. When a stimulus comes in and crosses the threshold, the neuron fires to its full potential. This is known as the action potential once again. But if the stimulus fails to cross the threshold, then the neuron will not fire at all. This is known as the resting potential. Well, you can compare an impulse to a burning fuse of a firecracker. When you light the firecracker on, the fuse slowly and steadily moves through and reaches its ultimate goal, passing on the message. Take a look at this image. The message is received from the dendrites and goes down to the axons. You see that the axon is divided into fibers, and at the end of each fiber, there is a terminal, a button that consists of a synaptic sac which contains neurons, which contains neurotransmitters that are responsible for converting the electrical impulse to a chemical impulse. So then, actually what happens is that there is a gap between the end of an axon and the dendrite of the receiving neuron. So how then does a nerve impulse go from one neuron to the other? What happens when a neural impulse reaches the end of the axon? Well, at the end, there are tiny junctions between neurons which are called the synapses. And the gap between these two neurons is called the synaptic gap, also known as the synaptic cleft. Now, like I said, most of these electrical impulses compulsorily, necessarily must be converted into chemical signals. Each axon branches out into fibers. And these fibers contain synaptic vessels or sacs which have neurotransmitters responsible for converting a neural impulse into a chemical signal. They transmit or carry information across the synaptic gap. Think of neurons as a ferry a ferry boat which takes the passengers from one end to the other. After delivering its message, the neurotransmitter is reabsorbed by the axon that released it. This process is called the reuptake mechanism. A message in the brain is ferried across the synapse by a neurotransmitter. Take a look at this image. It will make it a lot more clear. So you see the synaptic sac, which contains little dots that are neurotransmitters. You also see in the receiving dendrites that there is a channel which is closed. Now, the moment the neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic gap, a signal is sent to this channel of the receiving dendrite to open it up. Once the channel is open, the neurotransmitter takes across the message that is to be received by the dendrite of the next neuron. And so the message goes from one neuron to the other, from the dendrites to the axon, through the neurotransmitters and to the next waiting neuron. There are a few neurotransmitters that you might be knowing of and that is important for you to know of. There are several kinds. You have excitatory neurotransmitters, for example, dopamine, adrenaline, and noradrenaline. These neurotransmitters are responsible for arousing the body. That means, like we saw earlier in the previous videos, responsible for the flight or fight position in a threatening life situation. You have also inhibitory neurotransmitters like GABA, serotonin, and dopamine. These neurotransmitters are responsible for calming the body. So, when a threatening situation has reduced or when it has been eliminated, these are the neurotransmitters that are secreted to calm your body down. You have neurohormones as well, which are responsible for releasing hormones from the hypothalamus, for example, oxytocin. To summarize, a neuron sends information through its axon in the form of a brief impulse. You can think of this brief impulse as an electric wave from one neuron to the other. This brief electric wave is called the action potential and works on the all or none principle, which means that when the axon or when the nerve reaches its threshold, the message is fired. If the threshold is not reached, the message is not fired at all. We saw what happens when a neural impulse reaches the end of the axon. That through the neurotransmitters, an electrical wave is converted into a chemical signal and sent across. And we also saw the different kinds of neurotransmitters, which are excitatory, inhibitory, and neurohormones. A few questions for you to work on at the end of the class. What is a neural impulse? What is an action potential? Describe the process of synaptic transmission. Identify the different neurotransmitters and list out their functions. Again, the books for references are Laura E. Burke, Child Development, and Santrock, Child Development. You can also refer to other web references such as Byju's Learning App, Khan's Academy, Wikipedia, etc. Thank you for watching.